Imagine standing at the base of a medieval castle just before dusk. Stone towers rise like jagged teeth against the fading sky. Flags ripple in the freezing wind. The drawbridge groans as it closes for the night. Guards shuffle into position. Torches spit sparks that drift upward like dying fireflies. To any traveler watching from the road, this place looks invincible. A sanctuary carved from mountain and iron, a promise that once inside nothing harmful could ever reach you. But the true danger is already waiting inside. Because for the people who actually lived behind those walls, nighttime inside a medieval castle was not a moment of rest. It was a daily test of endurance, and for many, sleep itself became a gamble, a quiet, unsuspecting ritual that could turn fatal without warning. The castle, for all its majesty, was not designed to protect human comfort. It was designed to survive war. Every corner, every archway, every slab of granite served military logic, not human life. Once night fell and the courtyards emptied, the fortress revealed its true nature. A machine built to endure sieges, not shelter fragile bodies. Inside the great hall, a dim orange glow from dying hearth fires dances across the floor. Thick smoke snakes upward into rafters blackened by decades of soot. The stone walls exhale cold, like the breath of something ancient. Servants drag benches aside to prepare the sleeping area, creating a forest of bedrolls stuffed with straw that crackles like old parchment. But this straw is not clean, it never is. It contains sweat, mold, insects, spores, and fragments of yesterday's sickness. When someone exhales heavy from fever, that breath sinks into the bedding. When someone coughs during the night, that cough stays trapped between the floorboards. And when one sleeper stirs to escape discomfort, the dust rises, a cloud of invisible particles drifting into the lungs of dozens of others. The castle breathes in disease and breathes it right back out. And still, this is only the beginning. Because the real predator of the medieval night is cold. The walls thick enough to stop a trebuchet stone turn into massive ice sinks after sunset. They absorb heat from every body in the hall. They siphon warmth from the fires. They steal comfort from the air. A man might go to sleep wrapped in wool quilts and animal pelts and still wake up shaking violently. Frost creeps along mortar lines. Pitch torches shiver. Every sound echoes sharper, thinner, crueler. Generals and chroniclers wrote about defeating armies. None wrote about defeating winter inside their own homes. Up in the Lord's chamber, things are hardly better. His bed stands elevated like a throne of carved oak. Curtains hang heavy around the mattress, forming a private cocoon. Servants place heated stones under the covers to fight the cold. But curtains meant to trap warmth also trap the one thing nobody sees coming: stagnant air. Smoke drifting up from the hall, fumes from the hearth, unburned gases from a smoldering fire. They drift into the enclosed bed, unseen and silent. And once the Lord falls asleep, the danger becomes absolute. The same luxury meant to keep him warm becomes a coffin lined with velvet. Below, in the servants' quarters, a different nightmare unfolds. The castle's true residents, rats, emerge from holes in the walls. They scurry along rafters and drop onto bedding. They gnaw sacks of grain, rip through cloth and leave trails of filth as they move. Their parasites burrow into blankets, crawl beneath collars, nest in straw, and bite sleeping humans without waking them. Every medieval sleeper shared a bed with something hungry. Every night. And still, that is not the full list of dangers, because the air itself could kill you. A low-burning fire in a poorly ventilated room releases toxins that cannot be seen or smelled. A fireplace that draws poorly due to a shift in the wind can quietly fill a chamber with fumes. Even the great hall, enormous, crowded, and warmed by a massive central hearth, becomes a chamber of slow suffocation by midnight. The torches that promised safety in the corridors consume precious oxygen, leaving stairwells stale and heavy. Candles drip smoke onto tapestries. Hearths belch soot thick enough to stain lungs. And when the wind changes direction, the entire castle can fill with smoke so dense that navigating from one room to another becomes a blind man's trial. So how did anyone sleep? They didn't. Not well. Anxiety haunted the night as deeply as cold or illness. Darkness was not empty. It was filled with sounds that the imagination amplified into threats. The groan of wood, the hiss of wind through arrow slits, the scuttle of rodents, the shifting weight of other bodies, a drawn-out cough, a whisper, a footstep, a creaking door. You were never truly alone and never truly safe. Every person inside a castle slept lightly, nervously, with one hand on their possessions and the other near a weapon, even women, even children. Danger was always close, even when surrounded by allies. And rest, real rest, was a luxury almost no one experienced. This was the irony at the heart of medieval life. The castle that protected you from enemies was the same castle that could kill you while you slept. And the people who survived it weren't merely strong, they were resilient beyond imagination. Night did not fall gently upon a medieval castle. It pressed itself into its stones, seeped into its beams, coiled around its corridors, like a living being reclaiming its dominion. To anyone inside, dusk was not merely a change in light, but the awakening of another creature, the fortress itself. And as the last traces of daylight vanished behind serrated battlements, the residents braced for the ritual they knew too well, the slow suffocation of comfort, warmth, and safety. The experience began with the air. It thickened as darkness deepened, growing colder yet somehow heavier, laden with the icy breath of the castle's inner belly. Every fortress, no matter how grand or modest, possessed this phenomenon. Scholars never wrote about it, lords seldom acknowledged it, but every soldier and servant understood. The castle's stone retained the cold like an animal retaining memory. During winter it was merciless. During summer, it was deceptive, offering coolness by day only to exhale that same chill with doubled vengeance once the sun disappeared. No tapestry could stop it, no hearth fire could chase it away. The very walls seemed to breathe. Inside the great hall, where dozens of residents would soon attempt sleep, the cold crept along the floor first, a mist-like chill gathering around boots, seeping into the wool of cloaks, sneaking up legs and spines. It was a cold that bit. It stung the skin, then numbed it, then found the joints, and settled there like a parasite, preparing for a long winter's feast. The stones beneath the rushes, those scattered straw mats meant to keep the floor tolerable, felt as if they were carved from the bones of a glacier. A man could wrap himself in 2 wool blankets and still shiver enough to rattle his own teeth. Yet cold was only the first affliction. As the fires burned and dozens of bodies exhaled into the cavernous space, the walls began their nightly ritual. They wept. Thin beads of moisture formed between cracks in the masonry, gathering into droplets that slid downward in silent trails. Some reached the floor. Others clung to the surface like beads of sweat on a feverish brow. This stone sweat, as castle folk sometimes called it, was not merely an annoyance. It was a herald of sickness. The dampness gathered in corners where sunlight never touched, feeding dark colonies of mold that thrived behind tapestries. Even the wealthiest lord, whose personal banner hung bright in daylight, often slept only a few feet away from a thriving kingdom of fungi. And the smell, it was the odor of cold stone mixed with smoke, animal tallow, damp wool, and the earthy rot of old rushes. It embedded itself in clothes, in hair, in blankets. Servants often joked, in private, that once you spent a winter sleeping inside a castle, you carried the scent of the walls with you for years. The residents of the fortress learned to read these sensations, not simply as discomfort, but as warning signs. A night that began too damp might end with chills that kept a man bedridden for 3 days. A corridor that smelled too earthy might conceal mold dangerous enough to poison a child. A draught too strong near the hearth could pull smoke into an entire room, choking out anyone unfortunate enough to sleep too close to the floor. And then there were the sounds. The castle settled. It groaned. It shifted. Wind moaned through arrow slits, creating eerie tones like low flutes echoing through stone tunnels. Wooden beams creaked with the pressure of the cold, expanding and contracting as if they were desperately trying to breathe. Iron hinges clicked softly in the dark, their metal contracting in sudden snaps that woke restless sleepers. Children whispered that the castle spoke at night. Adults pretended they didn't believe the same. But the truth was simpler and far more unsettling. The structure was alive with its own rhythms. It was a machine built for war, not for rest. And as such, every part of it was designed for defense, not comfort. High ceilings that looked majestic during feasts became echoing chambers of drafts at night. Thick walls that kept out battering rams also trapped cold and moisture within. Narrow windows that allowed archers to fire arrows turned rooms into frozen caves where wind sliced through the interior like invisible blades. Even the design of the floors betrayed the residents. Many castles were built with uneven stone slabs that created small troughs where puddles silently formed during the night. A misplaced footstep on such a puddle could send a half-awake guard tumbling. Breaking bones on the same floor meant to protect him, and the higher one climbed, the more deceptive the fortress became. Tower chambers felt like sanctuaries at first glance, elevated, secluded, seemingly untouched by the chaos of the hall below. But elevation brought new dangers. Wind tore through tower rooms with unrelenting force, pushing through cracks in shutters, humming through keyholes, extinguishing small lamps so efficiently that even the wealthiest lord might find himself fumbling in darkness. And if the wind did not menace the inhabitants, the cold certainly did. Tower rooms were notorious for freezing trapped moisture into thin layers of ice that gathered near the walls or beneath the bedding. One wrong position during sleep, and a noblewoman or knight could awake with half-frozen limbs or a chest tight with the beginnings of winter fever. Despite all this, one truth overshadowed every other discomfort. No one, not the poorest stable boy, nor the most pampered highborn child, ever truly slept deeply inside a fortress. The castle demanded awareness. The stones demanded vigilance. The very architecture ensured that every creak, every gust, every whisper of wind or crackle of fire could be a warning, a sign, a threat. Because in a fortress built solely for war, rest was not a right, it was a risk. And every night, as residents surrendered themselves to uneasy sleep, the castle watched them quietly, silently, patiently, as if waiting for its next opportunity. As if the stone itself remembered how many had already died within its unyielding embrace. The great irony of medieval castles is that they were built to withstand armies, yet could not keep out the smallest invaders. When torches burned low, when conversations dimmed to whispers, when footsteps faded into tired shuffles, another population emerged, one that claimed ownership over every unseen corner of the fortress. If the cold and the damp were enemies woven into the stone, then the living threats were woven into the dark. The first sign of them was always sound. Not the bold noise of claws scraping across stone, but the soft, delicate rustle of something small navigating the rushes on the floor. It was subtle at first, a light scurry, a faint tap, the kind of noise one half registers before dismissing it as imagination, but the truth was far less comforting. The castle was alive with vermin. Rodents, particularly black rats, had colonized European fortresses long before any lord ever claimed a title. They were masters of infiltration, slipping through drainage channels, scaling rough stone walls, squeezing through cracks too small for a finger. And once inside, they thrived. Warm food stores, straw bedding, hidden crawl spaces within walls. The castle was paradise for them, a labyrinth built around their needs. And the residents? They were simply obstacles in the way. As the hour deepened into true night, the behavior of these creatures changed. Rats became bolder, no longer deterred by the presence of sleeping humans. They ventured closer, following the scent of leftover crumbs or the warmth radiating from slumbering bodies. Their little claws, tapping delicately on the floor, became the dominant nocturnal heartbeat of the fortress. People slept in clusters not only for warmth, but because there was safety in numbers. One man alone on a straw pallet could become a feast for vermin before dawn. Their presence brought more than fear. They carried fleas, and with fleas came sickness, fevers that racked the body, swellings that disfigured the flesh, and the unseen bacteria that could slip into a household and wipe out half its occupants. Yet medieval residents seldom knew the cause. They only knew that some nights a rat might bite a sleeper, and some mornings that sleeper might never rise again. Behind the tapestry walls, the situation was even more sinister. The very decorations meant to symbolize power and prestige became nesting grounds for colonies of rodents. They chewed through woolen threads, leaving trails of frayed fabric. They hollowed the spaces between stone and textile, creating warm tunnels where they slept through the day and multiplied through the months. Servants often discovered these nests only when forced to replace or clean the tapestries. They would peel back the woven panels only to be greeted with a wave of stench, a mixture of feces, decay, and the unmistakable odor of dozens of small bodies pressed together in secret darkness. Yet rats were only the kings of the hidden kingdom. They shared their realm with every crawling creature the medieval world could conceive. Lice infested linens and hair. Fleas nested in wool and tunics. Bedbugs hid between the joints of wooden furniture, waiting for the night's blood meal. Even the lord's chambers were not immune. Beneath velvet curtains, between folds of imported fabrics, parasites thrived. The most extravagant feather mattress, a symbol of wealth and privilege, could host hundreds of insects, feeding quietly as their host slept unaware, then retreating into the seams with bloated bodies and crimson bellies. And all the while, the castle breathed around them. The faint candle on a bedside table might flicker as a shadow darted past. A sleeping child might twitch as something brushed their foot. A guard posted near the granaries might hear the rattling sound of dozens of mice squeezing through a narrow gap to reach the sacks of grain. The infestation was so normalized that residents developed coping rituals. Fair soldier would clap his boots together each morning, shaking out spiders. A maid would sleep with her hair tied tightly to prevent lice from spreading. A cook would line storage shelves with herbs and ashes to deter rats, though these methods seldom worked. Parents would teach children to sleep curled tight, hands inside covers, to avoid bites on exposed fingers. In the darkest corners, the battles between vermin and humans took stranger shapes. Cats were bred inside castles specifically for pest control, but they faced adversaries that multiplied faster than any predator could hunt. When the cats slept, the rats ruled. And then there were the creatures no one wanted to speak of, those that entered through the moat or crept in from the surrounding wilderness. Stoats, weasels, snakes, bats, animals that found the warmth of a castle inviting, hiding in cellars or storerooms or rafters, appearing at the edge of torchlight like omens. Nights inside a medieval fortress were not quiet. They pulsed with life. They crawled with teeth and claws. They whispered with movement in the walls. And the residents, trapped within those ancient stones, slept with the unsettling certainty that they were sharing their resting place with an entire hidden ecosystem. An ecosystem that did not fear them. An ecosystem that thrived at their expense. Sleep, therefore, was not simply a vulnerability. It was a kind of surrender, a nightly gamble that nothing would bite or crawl or infect, or gnaw through the precious stores meant to keep the fortress alive through winter. Because in the end, the castle did not just house people, it housed everything that could survive the night. What most travelers and storytellers never understood about medieval castles is that the danger wasn't always dramatic. It wasn't the collapsing battlement, the ambush in the corridors, or the assassin slipping through a secret passage. It was the quiet things, the passive dangers, the ones that killed slowly, silently, almost politely, and among these, none were more feared by those who truly lived inside the stone fortresses than the poisonous materials, toxic comforts, and structural traps hidden in nearly every chamber. Far from the battlefield, inside the very rooms meant for rest, luxury, and dignity, the castle revealed its darkest secret. Even wealth could kill. The bedchamber, for example, the most intimate private space of any lord or lady, was filled with threats disguised as elegance. The walls were painted with vivid pigments, imported at great expense. The colors were rich, the scenes divine, and some of them deadly. A brilliant green mural meant prosperity. A deep royal yellow meant authority. A crimson border meant power. But in reality, these colors were forged from arsenic, lead, sulfur, and other minerals that released invisible toxins with every change in temperature. At night, when braziers warmed the room, the pigments awakened, and the lord inhaled poison while believing he slept in splendor. Even the tapestries, those grand symbols of wealth and culture, were hazards of their own. Dyes used to color them came from plants and minerals that, under heat and humidity, released particles capable of irritating lungs, inflaming skin, or triggering fevers mistaken for curses. The noble who slept under a cloth of gold and silk was, unknowingly, breathing centuries-old chemistry gone rogue. And then there was Ortina's the bed itself. A medieval noble's bed was enormous, a fortress within a fortress, layered with heavy curtains, thick quilts, furs, and feather-stuffed mattresses. To the outsider, it looked heavenly. To the inhabitant, it was a slow suffocation chamber. The curtains trapped smoke from the fireplace, stale breath, and the fumes of oil lamps. Feathers inside mattresses compacted over time, creating dense nests where sweat, mold, and parasites thrived. In the dark hours before dawn, the noble slept wrapped in warmth, and in an atmosphere with barely any ventilation. Some castle records even mention servants entering chambers at sunrise, only to find the occupant pale, dazed, or unresponsive, victims of what today we would recognize as oxygen deprivation, or carbon monoxide exposure. Though the medieval explanation was always more supernatural, an evil spirit sat upon the chest during the night. But perhaps the most underestimated killers were the walls and floors themselves. Built of limestone, shale, granite, clay mixtures, and mortar that often included organic fillers, like crushed animal bones, castle interiors were far from inert. They breathed, absorbing moisture, releasing minerals, sweating cold draft through microscopic gaps. And in some regions, the stone released natural gases from the earth itself. Underground chambers, wine cellars, storage halls, and servant quarters were sometimes filled with breathable but dangerous fumes that caused headaches, hallucinations, or collapse. The inhabitants assumed these rooms were cursed. In truth, the earth was simply exhaling. Then there were the floors. Polished with a mix of animal fat, oil, and resin to create a smooth surface resistant to dirt. Beautiful? Yes. Safe? Not at all. A single ember from a brazier rolling across such a floor could ignite it like dry tinder. Many castle fires didn't start from warfare, lightning, or sabotage. They started from a servant tripping over a weak torch. Even staircases were assassins. Medieval stone steps were narrow, uneven, spiraled tightly, and built intentionally irregular so invaders would stumble. But that meant residents stumbled too, especially at night, half asleep, carrying oil lamps that could turn a single misstep into a deadly fall or a catastrophic fire. Then there was the water. Inside castles, water wasn't fresh unless recently drawn. Stored in barrels, it developed bacteria that could cause chronic stomach illness or deadly dehydration. Many nobles avoided water entirely, relying instead on wine, ale, or mead, which in excess created its own chain of health problems, liver disease, hallucinations, or violent dehydration when combined with cold rooms and heavy meals. And finally, one danger surpassed all others: the filth trapped in beauty. Furs worn for warmth were rarely cleaned. Carpets were brushed, not washed. Velvet absorbed dust and oils and never fully released them. Everything that looked luxurious was a trap of parasites, fleas, bacteria, and invisible spores. In the quiet stillness of the night, these small dangers combined into a perfect storm, and the inhabitant of the grand castle found themselves resting inside a chamber engineered, unintentionally yet perfectly, to shorten their life. Everything beautiful was dangerous. Everything meant for comfort carried a hidden blade, and yet night after night the castle's inhabitants returned to these chambers without question, because danger, like cold and hunger, was simply part of the architecture of medieval life. If every hallway, bedchamber, and banquet room in a medieval castle carried hidden dangers, then nothing prepared the unsuspecting resident for the most lethal place of all, a room built specifically for safety, secrecy, and control. A room designed to protect the noble from enemies outside, but that in reality could kill its occupants faster than any invading army. This room was known by many names across Europe: the solar, the inner chamber, the withdrawing room, but its purpose was always the same: privacy. a luxury so rare in the medieval world that it was treated as a privilege only the elite could afford. Yet in the pursuit of seclusion, medieval architects engineered the perfect silent killer. These rooms were built deep inside castle keeps. Thick walls, tiny windows, layers of tapestries, heavy curtains, multiple doors. Each addition improved security but strangled ventilation. What emerged was the medieval equivalent of a sealed vault, trapping cold, smoke, moisture, and sometimes something much worse. Because what truly made these inner chambers deadly was the way they interacted with everyday life inside a fortress. The noble would settle in for the night, drapes drawn, a brazier glowing softly in the corner. The air slowly warmed, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to trigger the release of fumes from painted walls, oiled furniture, and burning charcoal. Then the oxygen began to thin, slowly, quietly, imperceptibly. The noble, wrapped in layers of blankets and furs, would grow drowsy, not from fatigue, but from pity. Oxygen starvation. Their breaths grew shallow, their chest tightened, their limbs turned heavy as lead. Outside the chamber, guards stood watch with unwavering discipline. Inside, the danger grew like a living creature. Sometimes, a shift in the wind sent smoke from the great hall drifting into the upper floors. Sometimes the brazier itself gave off fumes that collected beneath the canopy bed. Sometimes a damp tapestry released spores under rising heat. Sometimes rats gnawed through wooden beams, leaving dust and droppings that contaminated the air. But the most common killer was simple. Carbon monoxide, from smoldering charcoal braziers, a hazard completely unknown to the medieval mind. There were accounts, whispered by servants, written in margins of manuscripts, preserved in church records, of nobles who went to sleep perfectly healthy and never woke up. The cause was always attributed to divine punishment, fey magic, a curse, or night spirits pressing upon the chest. But the truth was far more terrifying than any legend. They suffocated inside their own sanctuary, and the castle's design didn't help. Many keeps had spiral staircases leading upward to private rooms. Warm air from the hall below would rise, carrying smoke with it. By the time it reached the solar, it was invisible, a thin, dangerous haze. Tempers worsened. Headaches became common. Nightmares plagued the residents. Fainting was frequent. Chronic illness spread among those who spent long hours indoors. Even royalty was not spared. The very architecture meant to defend their lineage worked against their bodies. Castle walls kept out armies, yes, but at the cost of trapping in the silent poisons that eroded health night after night. And even when a resident survived the hazards of the indoor chamber, they faced a final cruel danger. The alarm system of the medieval mind was tuned for intruders, not the invisible. They listened for footsteps on stone, for the clank of metal, for breaking glass, for whispered plots. But they never listened for the subtle cues of a room turning hostile. The drop in air, the dryness at the mouth, the dizziness before sleep, the strain in the lungs. Danger was everywhere, but it had no sound. If a fire broke out in a sealed chamber, it consumed the air long before the flames appeared. If smoke seeped in during the night, it carried no warning. And if moisture weakened beams above, they collapsed without giving the sleeper time to run. The result was the ultimate medieval irony. The safest room in the castle was often the most dangerous. The closer you were to protection, the closer you were to death. And for every inhabitant who stepped inside those luxurious private chambers, sleep became a gamble, a nightly confrontation with hazards no knight, no sword, no shield could repel. This was the secret truth of medieval castles, that real danger didn't storm the gates. It crept from the walls, the smoke, the air, and the very comforts meant to symbolize wealth and power. In the end, those who lived long enough to tell the tale were not the strongest or the bravest, but simply the luckiest.